Welcome back to this week's GCN Tech Clinic. You know the score of how this works. Send in your questions using the hashtag AskGCNTech. I pick out some of them and answer them as best as I can. So let's go to our first question. This is from Roy Peach, who says, "Hi Alex, Ollie and Manon, love the channel, always interesting." Thanks very much, kind start. My question is, I have a crank arm with a power meter on it and I was wondering if I could remove it and epoxy it onto a different crank arm. Thanks very much. No, I'm not sure this is going to be possible. Firstly, even if you manage to get the sensor off of the crank arm, I think chances are you might have ended up damaging it anyway, so it's not going to be any use again. And then if you're trying to epoxy it onto a new crank arm, firstly, you're not going to know what position to put the sensor because it's a very precise and carefully calibrated bit of equipment. And also, different crank arms and different materials exhibit different properties and amount of flex when a load is put through them. And seeing as that's how a power meter works, you're going to end up with a very inaccurate power meter reading, even if you somehow manage to get it to work. So, simple answer, no, I don't think it's possible. Although, I do remember a little while ago there was a company that would sell the sensor itself and it would come with a guide and a kit that was specifically designed to allow you to install it onto your crank arm. But this was very much down to careful placement and the correct calibration and the sensor knowing what crank arm you were putting it on, and it was a permanent solution, so it wasn't something that you could simply unstick and move on to your next crank. So unfortunately, I think you're stuck with it on that set of cranks. Next question is from John Sink, who says, made a newbie mistake and didn't locate the direction arrow when mounting my tubeless tyres. Should I remount them or can I ride with the tyres in the reverse direction? Will it damage the tyres? Yes, you can ride with your tyres on the wrong way round. Effectively, the rotating direction is facing backwards. Is it going to damage your tyres? No, absolutely not. Now, some people think that the rotating direction is there to allow the tyre to have the best grip possible. And in some aspects, I guess that's right, but nearly all of the grip and characteristics and properties of a tyre are all down to the tyre compound itself and the tyre pressure that you're using. Yes, if you want to get the very best performance from your tyre, then you need to fit it the correct rotating direction. But if it was me, I would probably swap it round. If you're slightly newer to tubeless tyres and you don't want the hassle and a little bit of mess that you could create by switching it around, just leave it, don't stress. Maybe when you've got a spare afternoon or your tyre eventually wears out, change it round. But if it bothers you, swap it round. If it doesn't, I certainly wouldn't worry about it and there's no risk of damaging your tyre. Next question is from Billy Binzak, who says, "Hey crew, looking at two different carbon wheel sets and want to know if the aerodynamic benefit of a 44 and a 54 set is worth it over just going for a 44mm depth for both wheels. Is it mostly a cosmetic decision?" So the difference between a 44 and a 54 when you have it in the back wheel is going to be fairly minimal. We're talking, well, it's 10mm for instance. So the aerodynamic advantage of a slightly deeper rim, it should be slightly faster when you're traveling at high speeds, but the difference is going to be very small. And as a counter argument for that, the slightly deeper wheel will be ever so slightly heavier. But again, it's only a very slight difference. Personally, I prefer to have matching rim depths on the front and the rear. I just think it looks a lot nicer and makes your bike look a lot smarter. So if you're worried about that, for instance, then go with the wheels that are the same depth front and rear. But if you want to have a bike that exhibits a slightly faster properties in terms of aerodynamic performance and riding at higher speed, then I guess the slightly deeper rear wheel would be the best option to go for. But like I said, the difference between it all is fairly minimal. So take your pick, and if it was me, I'd go for the same front and rear. Next question in is from Jay FOMO, says, "When I'm coasting at high speed, I notice my speed drops when I start pedaling. Why does this happen?" Now, there's been a couple of replies to this person's question. From someone that says, "I think you just need to change your legs." I don't think that's the answer to it. I think what it is that you're finding is your head unit is registering your speed from a GPS signal, and as such, it has a little bit of a lag between the speed that you're traveling at and the speed that it's reading. It isn't much, but it does happen. It's normally a second or so sometimes it can take for the speed change to register on your head unit. It's particularly apparent in areas where there's maybe wooded or trees everywhere, because it reduces the signal that your head unit can receive. And as such, there will be instances where you've already started to slow down and it takes a little bit of time for your head unit to catch up. Now, it could also just be pure coincidence that you're not really noticing that you're riding into a headwind, for example, or that you're just riding uphill and you haven't really noticed. So I don't think you're defying the laws of physics. I think chances are it's just a little bit of a delay in your head unit receiving the GPS speed. Next question in is from Oopsie, who says, are you better off with a new bike that costs around €3,000 or a second-hand one in good condition? I've noticed that you can get a Tarmac SL5 for that kind of money, or other top-of-the-range models. But are the new mid-range bikes better or worse? I'm aware that older ones might use rim brakes, but I don't mind that. It's a real tricky question, that, because it really depends on what you're trying to look at in terms of what's most important to you. Do you want the latest and greatest kit and technology? Because maybe if you do, you might have to get a brand new bike. But buying a bike that's either 6 months or a year old can really give you a significant saving in terms of value for money, because you'll be able to buy a bike that you previously wouldn't have been able to afford. And if it's less than a year old, chances are most of the components will be perfectly fine on it, providing it's been looked after and cared for by the previous owner. But something to bear in mind is that you are always at the mercy of wear and tear on components when you're buying second-hand, and as such, you could spend your hard-earned cash on a bike and then a few months down the line realise you need to replace some of the components. And if, because you bought second-hand, you've managed to get a sort of top-spec or top-of-the-range bike, when you go to replace the components, it may well cost you significantly more money than some of the mid-range components. Think of like 105, for example, group set of the people. So if it was me, I'd consider buying second-hand. I'd be very careful about assessing the condition of the bike, and I'd look to buy the newest or most recent second-hand bike I could possibly find, and I think that will offer you the best value for money. It's the same as many things in life. Buying brand new doesn't necessarily offer the best value for money, but you do get a nice shiny product, and something worth considering is that you will have additional support and maybe sort of warranty backup on some components if you buy them brand new from a bike shop or an online retailer. So there you go. Next question is from Rob Appleby, who says, hi tech team, my bike was set up following a bike fit with enough seat post, without enough seat post to fit into my workshop stand clamp. Any ideas for an alternative approach for supporting the bike when I'm cleaning or maintaining it? This is a problem I've seen a number of slightly smaller riders or people that have a smaller setup on their bike have. Quite simply, there's not enough seat post exposed from the frame to clamp the work stand round it. So the solution to this, I would say, is if you're doing a relatively easy or quick and simple maintenance task, just hook the nose of the saddle over your normal work stand. That'll be more than adequate enough to support the bike for maybe just checking the gears quite simply or some basic maintenance tasks. But the best solution I could think of in this instance would be to use the same sort of stands that you see lots of pro team mechanics use. This is one that you remove the front wheel, the forks are clamped into the bike work stand, and then it's supported underneath the bottom bracket. It allows you to spin the bike round and work on it in a fairly similar manner to what you would to a bike stand that clamps via the seat post. Obviously, you can't work on the front brake or anything to do with the front wheel in that instance, but it's a fairly simple process just to refit the front wheel and check over those components and anything they need to do without using that work stand. So hopefully that gives you a solution to your problem. Right, and then our last question for this week is from Mr. John Dope, who says, I'm planning to buy a carbon saddle, but I've learnt that it has different sized rails. Currently, my seat post is a 1-bolt type of clamping system. How would I know if the clamping system is compatible with carbon oval rails, so 7x9? is not fully indicated in the specs of the seat post. Is it safe to assume that the seat post is compatible already? No, I don't think it's safe to assume that the seat post is compatible already. So seat post clamps that go a single bolt and clamp on the side will need to be the right shape and profile specifically for the rails that they're intended for, be that round rails that you see on metal railed saddles or the oval rails which are used on carbon fibre ones. If it clamps from the side, the curve and the clamp faces themselves need to mimic the shape of the rails, otherwise you run the risk of damage them. And in the instance of fitting a carbon saddle with the round rail clamps, you'd simply crush the saddle rails and cause damage to that saddle, meaning you'd have to buy a new one. So most manufacturers do make different clamps to fit the different types of rail systems that are out there. So you could go to your local bike shop or contact your bike manufacturer online, and they're normally a relatively low cost part to buy, and it will come as a kit with a new bolt and the side plates to fit the oval rails. There are some seat post clamps out there that clamp from the top and the bottom, and in those instances you don't need to change the different clamp parts because they clamp from the top and bottom. It shouldn't matter whether you've got round rails or oval rails. But in this instance, I would contact your bike manufacturer and try and find the correct part for your bike, because you don't want to run the risk of damaging your brand new saddle. Hope that answers your question all right. Hope everyone's found this week's Tech Clinic helpful. Sorry if I haven't got to your question. Keep submitting it in the comment section down below using the hashtag AskGCNTech, and fingers crossed we'll get to it in the coming weeks. Right, that's it from me. See you later.